This thumbnail is my attempt to illustrate the left and right terror emanating from the same source. And I'm dabbling a little in AI, in AI so-called photography. I wanted to talk a little bit about Gladio. A lot of politicians around that time, from the 60s and 70s, prominent politicians like Fanfani, who was the six-time prime minister in Italy. For instance, he was not considered sufficiently loyal or predisposed or inclined or sympathetic to the Anglo-American agenda. So he was never informed about Gladio. And so you had a situation around that time where only those politicians who were friendly to the aims and objectives of the Anglo-Americans were informed. And those who were hostile to it were kept in the dark. I would put in that camp Aldo Moro, Enrico Mattei a little bit earlier. So another misperception is that about Gladio. Gladio was not part of NATO. It was not part of the integrated military organization. The Gladio networks were established inside what was known as the Atlantic Alliance. Thus it was that France continued to participate in Gladio even after France had left NATO. So there was no coordinating NATO responsibility for Gladio. But there was a superimposed body over NATO called ITAC, ITAC, the Intelligence Tactical Assessment Center, in which there was, among other things, a NATO desk. That NATO desk was owned by CIA, although it was nominally under the DIA. It was staffed by CIA. So Gladio was a European-wide operation, included, in addition to the Anglo-American alliance, it included Denmark, Norway, Holland, Spain, Turkey, and Greece. And I was surprised that Sweden was not part of it. Curious about Sweden, as always, and need to put aside some time to delve. Gladio was coordinated in Brussels through the CPC, so-called CPC, the Clandestine Planning Committee, which does meet periodically, and the chairmanship rotates among the secret services of the participating countries, the participating services of those countries. The entire organization is handled outside NATO, that is Gladio. There's varying dates given for when Gladio started. Some say it was 1951, when the general in charge of Secret Service in Italy, General Broccoli, wrote to the head of Chief of Staff saying that he had to send 6 officers to an intelligence course in England. And at this course, there was a special focus on explosives and arms. This was in Poole, UK. And these guys were invited by special forces, and the training also was at Hereford with the SAS, the Special Air Service. Also, Special Branch passed through these trainings, and it was created specifically originally to fight the IRA, and it was financed by the Anglo-Americans. This next detail reminded me of John Wick. lot of a lot of the John Wick franchise is taken from reality, and it looks. Some of it I think is so startling that it strikes one as being somewhat fantastical. But I was surprised at how much truth is in there. The Belgian stay-behind operators were paid in gold coins, kind of like in John Wick, if you've seen that, which is, I guess, a form of money for agents or instructors during times of war. So you had like 140-man force, logistics, training, supply, planning, but no active on the part of the Anglo-American Secret Service or Special Forces, no active taking part for in order to fulfill or to be true to the quote unquote doctrine of deniability, plausible deniability. Basically, they were saying, we'll help you, we'll teach you how to do something, but you guys have to do it yourselves, and we're not even going to tell you what to do. But we assume that you already know what you have to do. So there's a deputy chief of CIA in charge of Low Country affairs, in charge of the Dutch, the Belgians, and the Luxembourgeois. How he describes how the Low Countries, how they regarded and dealt with the stay-behind forces and operators. They handled it with great care. There was extreme secretiveness, and he recalls that the chief of service didn't want even to discuss, I think it's the Belgians, didn't want to even discuss in his office, and that they would go for a walk in the park to talk about the logistics. Another story about a French operator talking about being directed in 1945 by the Belgian Ministry of the Interior, Albert de Fleischauer, I think, to go and he directs him to go meet with his Italian colleague Mario Scelba in Rome. When he gets to Rome, Scelba informed him that they have to set up a stay-behind network, Le Glaive, Gladio. It's at that point where, you could say, does Gladio begin in 45 or 51? There's various dates. I think I've come across 3 or 4. And he then demonstrates, Shelba demonstrates how his forces could go live within 6 minutes. The threat in Italy, the perceived threat, was not at this point the Soviet army, but threat posed by the Italian communists, because they had gotten 40% of the vote in the elections, and this was Shelba's principal worry. As far as I know, on a higher up level, the fear was not even communism. The fear was independence. The fear was countries going their own way. That is, deviating from the one worldist conformity to the Anglo-American agenda, and the idea of having to fight communism was kind of this is how you hook the next level down. You get people committed to fighting because everyone's, there's a certain level of understanding among people that is very pumped up anti-communist, and you don't tell them about the real reason, you just wind them up and set them loose. But the U.S. was watching all this, and inside the government, George Kennan, who believed that he had this outrageous idea that we needed to send in American forces to stop the 1948 elections. And this was laughed out of the he was laughed out of the room basically by the president and nearly everyone else. General Marshall, James Forrestal, Allen Dulles. They realized the critical nature of things. The idea of sending troops to stop the 1948 elections in Italy was just beyond the pale. But they did realize that although they did have an intelligence service at that point, it had no capacity to carry out covert operations. They had no charter for it. And so this was remedied in 47, 48. So Gladio was set up in 48 and was operational within a year. Personnel was chosen carefully. You had veterans of the Spanish Civil War. Many came from the ranks of the Salo Republic. People who could handle arms. They formed squads of 9 people with 2 leaders, and someone had to know where the arms deposits were, the caches of supplies and money. And President Francesco Cossiga, Italian president, 1995 to 90, or rather 85 to 92, reports participating as a youth in 48. The young Christian Democrats. He was part of this. When he was 20 years old. They formed groups in the regional capital and in nearby towns. Where was this? A small town. This was not in Rome. They were trained. They used light machine guns. He personally had a Sten gun. The heads of the local carabinieri supplied them with hand grenades. And when the Communist Party ignored the will of the people or attempted to stage a coup, as they had done in, everyone had been watching Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, then they would intervene. There was no need yet for Gladio in Italy in 48. The CIA succeeded without it in its first major covert operations, which it just involved large sums of money helping the Christian Democrats defeat communism. It had been claimed that, or people had claimed that CIA created Gladio, but this would be, according to most people, impossible. CIA was created in September of 49, and we have all indications show that Gladio was already up and running in 48 in Italy, Switzerland, France, Belgium, most likely Spain before then. So, but the Americans got in on the action. The Communist Party had become very powerful in Belgium. There was a drive among the right to bring back Prince Baudouin, and the left, of course, fiercely opposed this. And the leader of the Communist Party, Lao, was killed. He was the most outspoken anti-monarchist at the time in Belgium, and he was killed in 1950 by someone coming out of a right-wing resistance group, the Secret Army. And then they At that point, they had commissions set up in Italy to deal with these unsolved acts of terror. We're talking about Piazza Fontana, the train station attacks in Brescia, Bologna, and a small-scale attack in Peteano. Let's see, the Bologna railway bombing, that was much later, 1980. Peteano, you had a Senator Libero Gualbieri, head of the Italian parliamentary inquiry into Gladio at that time. People, as this information and as the awareness of this secret network emerged, you had more interest, more curiosity on the part of certain politicians who had there to before that time they had been completely in the dark. You have, in a sense, you could call him a whistleblower, Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who was a former member of the far-right neo-fascist group Ordine Nuovo. And Peteano, according to him, was an act of war. The police forces, security forces, political groups, which had been making use of the secret services and the security forces, had been manipulating Italian neo-fascism ever since 45 and 46. And so those that were in these groups, these passionate true believers like Vincenzo Vinciguerra, decided to fight back and to lash out. Peteano was a revolt against this manipulation in retaliation against the state for being used. And so on the 31st of May in 1972, the Carabinieri in Peteano received a phone call, and basically it said a car with 2 bullet holes in the windshield is parked on the road from Posato Fermata to Savonia. That was the message. So go check it out. 3 policemen then were dispatched. They were lured to a car that was rigged with explosives, and all 3 were killed. So according to Vinciguerra, the right had customarily attacked civilians. They were not supposed to attack the state or its representatives, only innocent people outside the political system, in order to cause people to look to the state for protection. Does that sound familiar? To turn to the regime for greater security. And this was the role, this was the job delegated to these neo-fascist groups. So they placed themselves at the service of the state in order to create a strategy of tension that we now is employed, which is, scalable, right? Very local, very small scale, all the way up to, we now associate this with the strategy that NATO has been, and the West has been using against Russia and China. People had to be made to believe that at any moment, this is, for about 30 years, I mean, in terms of this iteration of this strategy from 1960 to the mid-80s, a state of emergency could be declared at any time, and people would then willingly trade some of their freedom for security. These are just basic freedoms, the freedom to walk in the streets, to go to the banks, to take the trains. This was the political logic behind the bombings. The perpetrators remained unpunished because the state could not really condemn itself. These were covert acts conducted by the hidden network working for the state. So judges noticed that in each case a certain level of interference, sometimes very high level of interference on the part of the services, the police security and the organs of the state. Instead of helping the magistrates, they were tampering with the records to hide the truth. And the clandestine structures inside the Italian Secret Service were first exposed in 1984. As a result, some revelations, Vinci Guerra revealed in court that these structures had links to CIA and Western secret services, including, and I think, or I'm not sure if it came out, but it always, for people who are unafraid and really track these things down, it does always go back to MI6. I mean, you can be sure that anything CIA does interfering in other countries, first of all, they have to be wound up and set in that direction by MI6. You had General Gerardo Serravalle, commander of Gladio from 71 to 74. Bombers, as he says, bombers like Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who was the confessed perpetrator of the Peteano bombing, described to Judge Casson in 1984 the structure. He describes in great detail the structure of Gladio with great precision and in such detail that it could have been the declaration of Prime Minister Andreotti years later. So Andreotti was eventually, he came to the knowledge of Gladio, and it very possibly could have been taken directly from the testimony given by Vinciguerra. And so, he was asked, Vincenzo, how did you know? And he said, well, I was part of the Ordine Nuovo, which was linked to Italian Secret Service. And General Serravalle, he goes on, he elaborates, gladiators. He says gladiators who were enrolled received certain information, bits of information which would become available to them over time. They weren't told everything from the start. It was on a need-to-know basis. They were told nothing, for instance, nothing about the NATO links. That one of the bombers never contacted or was recruited by Gladio could describe. So apparently he was never even contacted or recruited by Gladio. But he could describe in such detail, makes one think that, or this is the general, he said it made him think that he made him suspect that someone like Vinciguerra could elaborate so precisely on Gladio. It made him think that there was in fact a sort of underground system which knew about the arms deposits, the clandestine structures, and which acted under the cover of official structure. So for 40 years, everything had been done to keep it all secret. And some regarded this as kind of a miracle. Italy not known for being able to keep things secret, managed to keep this secret, which of course made me immediately suspect the involvement of Freemasonry and high-level British involvement. The Duke of Kent, remember, was behind the setting up of the P2 Lodge. And sure enough, you scratch the surface, you get... you start to encounter characters connected with the Knights of Malta, the Hospitallers, Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. You go up the food chain. You begin to encounter people with higher level connections. That's a whole other subject, though. So the Italian stay-behinds were taken to train in Sardinia. There was a base there, Poglina, the Center for Sabotage Training. It's an infamous base at Capo Marargin. First time in 1959. 1959 to 91, Ennio de Colle, transported in planes within blacked out. He talks about being transported in planes with blacked out windows, transferred then onto a bus with blacked out windows and dropped off in front of their quarters. This was all done under the auspices of a department called the Office of Research, the R Office. And normally this office trained spies and special units. Counter-espionage were under the command of the D Office, and both were under control of CIFAR, which is Italian Secret Services. And the recruits were informed as to the top secret nature of their work. Their names, they were told their names would not be revealed. They were trained in firearms, and they were shown the explosives. The explosives were explained to them, although only the experts, the trainers, were allowed to touch the explosives. General Serravalle, he was his intention to meet some of the gladiators trained for potential domestic intervention. Contingencies needed to be anticipated. We need to be prepared and plan contingencies planned for in the event of an imminent invasion to prevent the collaborators of the Warsaw Pact from acting behind the backs of the resistance. Ordine Nuovo never had its own ideology. They called themselves National Socialists. But its boss, the boss of Ordine Nuovo, Pino Rauti, worked for the armed forces, was SID, Italian Secret Services expert. He recruited men to these parallel structures. Pino Rauti said that instead of a frontal assault, they have put a military capability into the midst of governments, unwitting governments. So I think that's a good deal of information. We could go Peteano. There was a church, in other words, let's see, General Paolo Inserilli, commander of Gladio 1974 to 86, recalls that some of the magistrates believed that they had discovered the location of an explosives cache that was used in the Peteano attack. The journalists from Il Gazzettino went to warn Padre Gucciano, the parish priest at San Vito a Tagliamonte, and was asked about whether he knew about the arms deposits at his church. And they dug into the ground just outside the perimeter of it looked like a back patio porch area, and they dug a little, and they quickly recovered 2 boxes, and then a box was recovered which contained a phosphorus bomb. And at that point, the carabinieri were sent outside, and the experts opened the boxes, and then another box was dug up, and it had machine guns, and these machine guns were just absolutely brand new. Senator Libero Gualtieri, the head of the Italian parliamentary inquiry to Gladio, he reported later that the regional commanders were told to confuse the magistrates by telling them that the guns came from smugglers or the Germans, while knowing full well, knowing all along that they were Gladio guns. And after Petiano, a mechanism was put into place to be used in all such cases to cover up. So then they had a whole kind of protocol that they would, after Petiano, kind of template they could apply to cover these things up. So the Carabinieri, the Minister of Interior, the Customs and Excise Police, the civilian and military secret services, they all knew the truth, which was that Vince Guerra was responsible. They all knew this within 20 days. But although he was attacking the state, he was retaliating against the state, in order to keep the whole thing under wraps for political reasons, they decided to cover it up. In fact, even the head of the Carabinieri was convicted of covering it up, Mingarelli. So that's just a little bit. There's more, but that's enough to begin with. I got a lot of this information from a BBC documentary, and it's fascinating to me. Well, it's not fascinating, totally to be expected. No mention of British involvement. The fine British hand that is directing all of this. They kind of characterize Gladio as a lot of sort of wild-eyed, nutty Italians running around with bombs and killing innocent people, which, you could say is fairly accurate. But then the level of secrecy required and the overall overarching strategy, no, this is coming right out of the Anglo-American agenda. And which is why, when you had someone like Aldo Moro coming out and advocating for development in Africa and national development in Italy, he becomes instantly a target of these people. And that gets left out. And I have did a video a few months ago about Aldo Moro. This is back in May. You might want to check that out. I'm going to get into it again though, because there's more hard evidence pointing to the British Crown, even Prince Charles himself, and of course Henry Kissinger, who had threatened Aldo Moro in person in a hotel. I think it was in New York. So that gives us a little taste of Gladio.